Fabiola Cabeza de Vaca was a champion of New Mexico tradition and culture.
Fabiola Cabeza de Vaca was an articulate writer, prolific, a teacher from the Llano Estacado. What made her so brave and so intelligent?
Well, I think in terms of brave, one of the first things that comes to mind is just biographically, her mom died when she was very little. So she was raised on the ranch with her dad and a lot of the vaqueros. And so if you think about the Llano Estacado, it's this really stark landscape. She describes it in one of her books as loneliness without despair. It looks flat. It doesn't look anything like, these green, lush valleys. Some days it hasn't rained for so long, the sky almost bleaches white. So it looks like a landscape that would have to make you brave, right? Because to see that kind of openness, it can be overwhelming. And to try to find water and make a living from a place that's so dry, that's so hard to access, resources from, I think you have no choice but to become resourceful. And I really think, she looked around at her community and thought, not just how are we surviving and how are we flourishing, but how can we take these skills out into other parts of rural New Mexico? And that's really what she did. One of the things that's really fascinating about her is she became an extension agent. So her work, like her schoolwork, was in home economics. She talks about it as kind of like this science, right? And you read her work and it's all about these chemicals that you put together, to make the kind of the best nutritional kind of value, like elements and minerals and stuff like that that we would never think about. And so I think like when she became an extension agent, she was really, really determined to bring that knowledge out to the rural communities of New Mexico. So she went to the, smaller Hispano villages, but she went to the pueblos. And she does talk really interestingly about how she became part of these communities. Like she even talks about San Ildefonso, which we tend to think about, pueblo communities as maybe being a little more isolated. But she talks about becoming part of these communities. And these were like, and became like not just comadres, but almost like relatives. And I think that's really important, and why she was probably so tenacious is she was going to go visit her family, right?
And she's the author of the first bilingual cookbook in New
Right,
Mexico.
yes, she is. That came out in the early 30s. And it's full of just recipes, and it's interesting because we tend to think of cookbooks as just being cookbooks, but in her work, it's really about also expressing New Mexican culture and in really thinking about how women are the caretakers of that culture, right? Through the food we make, through sitting around in the kitchen, doing the work we do.
Right, and it seems like she definitely secured those cultural practices in her writing.
Yes.
But also brought in an element of modernity.
I really think it was about bringing knowledge across the communities, about how to make life a little bit easier, how to incorporate these new kinds of technologies into their kitchens. One of the things she focuses on a lot is pressure cookers, and how pressure cookers can cook food in far less time than, your wood stove or anything like that. So it's just like, she is spreading the gospel of the pressure cooker, which I think sounds like kind of, maybe trite or insignificant, but it's significant. Like it changes the way women cook in the state. Prior to her work, people were drying food, and then she comes in and it's about canning food, right? And I think that's also a really important way of getting, how to keep the stuff that we've grown all season fresh and accessible throughout the winter, because we know our winters in the Llano Estacado are kind of frightening.
Right.
My grandmother's still using a pressure cooker in the 1980s, and I think it's a legacy of this. That's really what I thought when I was looking at the archive, is it's a legacy of probably Fabiola Cabeza de Vaca going through saying this is a way to save time and give more time to your family.
And in what ways was she informed through her cookbook about the ways of the land, the language, the people, the women?
So she had that cookbook first, and then she kind of updated it in The Good Life. And what she does in that cookbook is combine recipes and food with the seasons, with the landscape, with how families work. One of the big seasons, obviously, is spring, is planting season. So up in Las Vegas, where she's from, and in other parts of New Mexico, you can kind of count on the last freeze happening before May. So on May 15th, which is San Isidro Feast Day, that's when people plant, like officially. And that's when the ceremonies happen and the singing in the fields and all of this really beautiful stuff. So throughout her cookbooks, she really talks about, at this time of year, this is what's growing. Or at this time of year, this is what we've harvested and how we preserved it. And this is when you eat it. And then, she combines that with, cultural practices.
Have you tried any of her recipes?
Yes, I've tried the calabacitas because it's easy, right? It's just cake. Atole because it's also easy. There's the ones that are a little bit more intimidating. Like she talks about things like making cheese every day. I'm never going to try that. That's a little intense.
Yeah.
But yeah. There's stuff that, we know now we're supposed to be eating, right? The Three Sisters, corn, beans, and squash. And she makes sure that that's part of something that's included in her cookbook. So it actually is, pretty practical. Like anybody could pick up The Good Life and try those recipes.
Do you think she wanted to bring New Mexico into the future?
I think it's a combination. She wanted to bring technology and I think make things easier for these women that she saw in these communities across the state. But I also think she wanted to preserve the culture of it, which is why she talks so much about how these particular foods interact with these particular times of the year, because there's something we're planting that time of the year. There's, in winter, it's storytelling time. So she talks about gathering around the wood stove and eating these foods, but also, engaging in activities like weaving and colcha or embroidery. And those are things that are very traditional to our state. So it's cultural practice with environmental practicality with technology.
Why is her work important to us today?
In terms of just cultural preservation, that's probably the most basic one, right? Is it's teaching us what we were like and what we were doing, almost 100 years ago now, really. But the other reason is important is because you've seen, I know we all have seen, the kind of movement towards sustainability in our state and across, the United States, because we really do need to take into account kind of the scarcity of our resources. And she's really doing that in the 1930s because she's had to from where she grew up, right? Those resources were always scarce. It's important also to understand sustainability, to understand foodways. Fundamentally, it's good for us to follow the seasons, right? And to put that food in our body at that particular time of the year. And to think as much as 80 years ago, 90 years ago, we were already crossing borders, right? She was leaving New Mexico to go to Mexico. She has these sections in her archive of going to Spain. And it's there's this reputation of New Mexico as being isolationist. But we were actually always kind of transnational. And I think she reminds us of that.
She was a wandering spirit, but with a mission.
Yes, with a very particular mission.